Dawn did not break over northern Kyushu so much as leak thin, pale and brittle with early autumn cold. The first alarm klaxon wailed through Itazuke airfield at 0600 hours, cutting across the lacquered silence of barracks and revetments like a saw blade. A watch officer stumbled from the operations hut, clutching a grease pencil and strip map. Above him, the sky was a deep, unsympathetic blue, the kind aviators called hard air. It offered no cover and no mercy. On the plotting table, a young controller traced a jagged chalk line approaching from the East China Sea. Bearings repeated, altitude updates staggered, range ticked down. The voice from radar struggled through static. Multiple contacts, Angels 3-1, speed high, heading southeast to northwest. On another strip, a single word, Superfortress. For months it had been rumor, half believed and half dreaded, a bomber bigger than any the Imperial Navy or Army had ever faced. 4 engines that could carry it beyond 30,000 feet, guns in blistered turrets, range measured not in kilometers but in continents. Now the rumor breathed. At Itazuke and Ashiya both, crew chiefs moved before being ordered. Ki 44 Tojos, oil-dark radials coughing awake, J-2M Raidens, the lightning bolt interceptors, almost too new for the field mechanics to trust. Men pulled chocks, slapped fuselage skins, buckled cowling latches with numb fingers. Oxygen bottles hissed, ground crew rubbed frost from regulators, cursing quietly because breath fogged and froze on lips. Pilots hurried across tarmac, boots slapping, helmets crooked under arms. They had been trained for many enemies, B-17 flying fortresses over Rabaul, B-24, liberators over Truk, stubborn torpedo planes at Midway, but not for this. A bomber that flew where Japanese fighters did not comfortably breathe. Engines roared, a line of Tojos taxied like impatient dogs straining chains. The first flight leapt down the runway, tails lifting, wheels slapping tarmac before pulling free of earth. A second flight followed, Raidens accelerating heavy with promise and untested design quirks. The climb began. Not a graceful arc, but a wrestle against gravity, altitude, and physics themselves. Cockpits became furnaces first, then refrigerators. Manifold pressure needles crept toward red lines. Mechanics on the ground muttered prayers for piston rings they had polished by hand. At 6,000 meters, the air thinned. A Ki 44 pilot later wrote in his pocket diary, "Machine shakes like winter fever. Oxygen tastes like paper. Eyes narrow. Heart thumps in ears. Oxygen regulators wheezed like old lungs. Some valves froze. Others delivered too little." A Raiden pilot tapped his mask, then slapped it, then tore it loose long enough to gasp freezing air before jamming it back. Their world shrank. Just needles, shaking rivets, the raw craving for breath, and the absolute necessity to keep climbing. Above, contrails appeared chalk-white scars burned across a sky turning milk-bright with morning. Tiny silver insects traced them. But insects did not shine like that. They glittered, then multiplied, then swam in formation like a slow, terrible constellation. At 27,000 feet, the climb stalled. Not completely, just enough. Climb rate dropped from hundreds of meters per minute to a handful. The Japanese fighters hung in air like kites on slack string. The bombers did not descend to meet them. They continued their quiet procession at more than 30,000 feet, black bellies glinting silver, propeller arcs mere ghost wheels. A pilot of the 302nd Naval Air Group would later testify in a post-war interview, his hands still shaping the memory in the air. They lived above us, as though they belonged to another world. Their contrails were like rails in the sky. We could see them, hear them faintly, yet never quite touch. An order crackled over the radio. Push throttle, close. Pilots obeyed, knowing what full throttle meant. Engines shuddered, temperatures spiked, intercoolers strained. A Ki 44's supercharger whined like a blade against steel. The Raiden's dual-stage blower marvel on paper, menace in practice, starved, coughed, and surged. A few aircraft clawed a few hundred extra meters, enough to see the American giants clearly now, stainless armor plates, broad tail fins, turrets tracking like slow eyes. On the bomb bay doors, numbers and nose art, and behind every belly blister, gleaming, 50 caliber barrels waiting. No bursts of tracer fell, no guns barked, no dogfight spiraled open. There was only the sound of engines at their limit, and the quiet, humiliating distance between hunter and prey. One Japanese flight leader tried to dive for speed, then zoom climb. The maneuver bought him perhaps 10 seconds of hope. His aircraft rose, engine screaming, nose quivering, then stalled below firing range. He leveled, gasping, mask frosting, and watched as the bomb bay doors of a superfortress yawned open like a metal jaw. He would later write, "We did not lose, we failed to arrive." The bombs fell long, silver chains tumbling into cloud bound for steel targets and smokestacks around Kokura and Fukuoka. Black puffs of flak rose harmlessly below them. The fighters turned home one by one, fuel gauges trembling near empty, oxygen nearly spent, arms limp with exhaustion from fighting controls frozen by thin air. Some pilots descended unconscious, saved only by altitude-triggered regulators or sheer luck. A Key 44 returned with its pilot, blue-lipped, eyes glassy. Ground crew dragged him from the cockpit like a drowned man pulled from sea. When the first group rolled to a stop, engines coughing, mechanics rushed in, not cheering, not congratulating, but silent. They saw the thin crust of frost on flight suits, the blood where masks had bitten cheeks, the blankness in eyes that had looked at enemy aircraft and been simply out of reach. Inside Itazuke operations, a chalk hand moved reluctantly. Raid height updated, enemy course logged. No victories. No losses yet. Just the heavy silence of comprehension. In a corner, a flight officer whispered, almost prayer-like, "They fly in a world above war." His senior replied, flat and tired, "No, they bring war from above. We must find a way to climb there." Outside, the contrails faded slowly in the cold morning light, dissolving into emptiness like chalk washed from a board. But the mark they left in the minds of the defenders, in the arithmetic of altitude and horsepower, would not fade. That October morning on Kyushu, men trained to fight discovered a truth that could not be shot down. The battle had moved into air too thin for them to breathe. And war, ruthless in its mathematics, had followed. They had not been defeated, they had simply failed to arrive. And now, the sky itself had become the enemy. The after-action rooms smelled of cold rice, exhaust soot, and the faint vinegar sting of sweat drying in flight gear. Maps lay pinned to plywood boards, altitudes scribbled and re-scribbled in charcoal strokes that smudged under anxious hands. Outside, the mechanics beat frost from fuel drums with wooden mallets, and the cough of generators carried through the early dusk. Autumn had sharpened by then, and every breath on the tarmac came out white. There were no celebration banners, no banzai shouts, only quiet voices and the shuffling of boots. The pilots returned not beaten, but humbled, thin-lipped from the masks, eyes red from oxygen starvation, shoulders sagging as though altitude still pulled at them. The first reports spread like cold water poured down a spine. Superfortresses operating above 30,000 feet. No interception achieved, rate of climb insufficient, aircraft performance degraded above 9,000 meters. One staff sergeant, chalk in hand, murmured as he updated the board. They live at altitudes where we pray for engines not to freeze. Engineers descended on the returning fighters as if the secrets were in cylinders and spark plugs rather than numbers and physics. Hands black with oil, they checked magnetos, bled fuel lines, measured intercooler temperatures with instruments patched by wire and string. A maintenance officer of the 47th Sentai wrote in his notebook, "Engines, excellent. Pilots, excellent. Machines pushed beyond realm designed for them." The J-2M Raiden had been born for home defense, thick-backed fuselage, powerful Mitsubishi engine, two-stage supercharger, but theory and operational reality parted like fog before sunrise. Supercharger gears whined, manifolds rattled. Cylinder heads threatened to crack if pushed a moment longer. The Ki-44 Tojo, once proud terror of China skies, found the stratosphere a different battlefield. Its engine strained like an ox in winter mud. At altitude, even the fierce Ha-112 engine felt like a lung-fighting pneumonia. Yet the pilots asked for more. They always asked for more. Can we strip armor? Reduce ammunition? Improve oxygen feed? Their commanders answered with bitterness wrapped in courtesy. We will send requests. Everyone knew what that meant. Requests vanished into the bureaucracy like pebbles tossed into a river. Despite exhaustion, training flights continued. Pilots climbed again and again and again, fighting the same thin air, the same burning lungs, the same frost on goggles, the same cruel line of plateau in the climb rate. On wind-scraped runways, instructors hammered into young airmen the brutal arithmetic of high-altitude war: altitude first, speed second, honor third. Gone was the era when a pilot's courage alone altered outcomes. Gone the belief that spirit could beat horsepower. One instructor, a veteran from the Philippines campaign, shouted through the prop wash, "Do not chase them like heroes. Chase the sky first. Only then may you chase the enemy." The teenagers nodded, understanding, yet not truly understanding. They still believed war bendable to willpower. They would learn otherwise. Reports filtered in from intelligence officers, hard numbers, cold numbers. American bombers, escorted by P-48s and later P-51s, fighters with turbos and two-stage blowers that held power in thin air like lungs made of metal. The mechanics muttered new curses: turbo supercharger, intercooler ducts, high-octane fuel. The words sounded foreign, like sorcery. Pilots read captured bulletins, hands trembling not from fear but from disbelief. American bomber altitude operations. 31,000 to 33,000 feet. Escort fighters retain climb at altitude. A Raiden pilot crumpled his briefing sheet and whispered, "They fly where gods breathe." Evenings brought a hush over the airfields. Wind rattled corrugated tin hangars. Men smoked thin cigarettes and warmed hands over fuel drum fires. They stared at the night sky, clear, pitiless, and too wide to comprehend. Some prayed, some sharpened bayonets out of reflex, though no bayonet could touch a machine above the clouds. A junior officer broke the silence once. "Why do they come so high?" An older pilot answered without turning his head, "To show us altitude is a weapon." The younger man frowned. "And what weapon answers altitude?" The senior exhaled slowly. "Industry." That answer hung in the air like frost. No one challenged it, no one dared. By November, the sound alone ignited dread. Not the bombs, not the turret guns, not the American voices on radio static, the contrails, white lines turning the sky into a chalkboard of strategy and supremacy. Some pilots said they could hear the bombers through oxygen hiss, engine vibration, and wind roar, a deep harmony of four great engines that sang of factories oceans away. Every contrail written overhead was a reminder. The war had expanded into a ceiling Japan could see, but not reach. And yet, no pilot requested leave. None refused sortie, none surrendered to despair. They tightened gloves, checked oxygen lines, and rehearsed emergency dives. A Tojo pilot, face still windburned, wrote in his logbook that night, "If duty demands we climb until lungs burst, we climb. If we die without touching them, we die still climbing." Younger, scribbled simply, "Tomorrow, perhaps a little higher." In the barracks, men slept in flight jackets, oxygen masks hanging beside futons like lanterns for another world. The engines cooled, the stars sharpened. Somewhere beyond sight, American aircraft glided home untouched. And in the cold dark before dawn, while the fields of Kyushu slept under frost, mechanics and pilots shared the same silent understanding. Tomorrow the siren would wail again. Tomorrow the climb would begin again. Tomorrow they would try to reach a war being fought above the sky they once owned, because pride could not reach that high, Courage could not reach that high, but they would climb anyway until the thin air itself became their enemy. The winter wind came down from Mount Homan like cold steel drawn across the land, hissing through pine and bamboo as though even the trees were shivering at the sound of distant engines. Frost feathered the canvas wing covers, and rime crept into every seam of flight suits. Even before the sirens cried, men at Itazuke and Ashia were awake, breath steaming in the frigid pre-dawn murk. By December, the routine was ritual. Fuel trucks grinding through snow mud, armourers with numb hands feeding belts of 2 0mm and 1 3mm rounds, mechanics warming engines with charcoal braziers, praying sparks would not betray them, pilots massaging oxygen masks like monks handling relics. Above all, the anticipation not of battle, but of altitude, a more merciless foe than any enemy pilot. Radar reports arrived with the same bitter tone. 11 contacts, 20 contacts, 30 silver shapes, angels 3-1, speed constant, course steady. B-29s again. Daylight, confident, untouchable. Fighter alert bells cracked the cold silence. The ground seemed to jump with each key 44 throttle burst. Raiden engines hammered their shock into the air, prop tips flashing pale arcs. The scramble was well drilled now, boots slamming metal ladders, gloved fingers slapping buckles, oxygen mask straps snapping tight. A maintenance corporal yelled, "High blower only above 9,000 meters, do not overheat in climb." A pilot grinned bitterly. "If only the engine would overheat, we must first reach where the air lets it burn." The joke died quickly. Wheels lifted, flaps folded. The world fell away beneath wings that had wrestled gravity too many times to still feel eager. The first 10,000 feet came grudgingly, engines humming strong, gauges respectable. At 15,000, needles trembled. Engines grew hoarse. At 20,000, frost spiderwebbed cockpit glass edges. Pilots breathed shallow. At 23,000, voices became strained. At 25,000, breath tasted metallic. At 27,000, men began to pray not for victory, but for sustained consciousness. More oxygen. Line frozen. Regulator poor. Each sentence clipped, robotic, as thought slowed in the starved brain. A Raiden stalled in a climbing turn, just a wobble, then a soft fall like a feather dropping in syrup. The pilot recovered only after losing 5,000 feet, cursing at himself, at gravity, at physics. Then the sight, always the sight. A ruler straight line carved in white, then another, and dozens more, contrails striding across sky like celestial roads, and on them, silver bodies gliding, with serene invulnerability. A B-29 formation in winter air resembled no bomber fleet of earlier years. It was not a flock. It was an architecture, massive, regular, inevitable. Their engines did not roar from afar. They hummed a distant cathedral organ, 4 deep notes per giant. One pilot whispered through a frozen mask, "We chase ghosts, carved from sunlight." He was not romantic. He was simply oxygen-starved and brutally honest. They dived to gain speed, every sortie now a ballet of physics fought with desperation. Dive, zoom, hope to touch the unreachable. One Tojo managed a climbing burst just long enough to see tracers arch into nothing. The American giant neither dipped nor turned. The gunner never even acknowledged his presence. Too small, too far, too slow. He descended shaking, stunned not by failure but by irrelevance. Below, citizens watched too, farmers pausing in frost-lit paddies, coal stokers leaning from locomotives, schoolchildren shading eyes. They had seen Allied raids before, Liberators, Mitchells, the older flying fortresses. But the Superfortress came differently, higher, slower seeming, because speed doubled when altitude doubled, undisturbed by fighters below, indifferent to flak blossoms. In the village near Ashia, an old fisherman muttered, "Those are not planes, those are skyships." His grandson whispered, "Grandfather, if they are ships, why do they not fall?" "Because they belong to the sun." At night, pilots lay awake, not fearing death but insignificance. The samurai spirit had been forged for duels, for blood met with equal blood. But what blade touches a castle floating in the sky? What courage cracks pressurized aluminum at 9,000 meters? They were warriors asked to fight eternity with muscle and breath alone. A diary entry from a young Ki-44 pilot read, "This is not war of men, this is war of engines. They fight with factories, we fight with lungs." Another wrote only, 3 words in charcoal, "Altitude is defeat." And yet each morning, boots lined the runway. Each sortie, controls shaken with cold defiance. Each climb, hearts thudding like drums in thin atmosphere. Not because they believed they would win, but because duty demanded ascent, even into futility. One squadron leader addressed his men before dawn. "Listen carefully. We do not climb to kill today. We climb to learn, to endure, to show the Emperor the sky did not break us first." Silence. Then nods grim, tired, unbowed. In the dim light, frost rimmed every collar, every glove, every metal edge. And still, engines turned, wheels rolled. They rose again, chasing contrails until vision blurred and hope thinned with the air itself. They had not yet found a way to reach the high citadel of America's war machine, but they had found something else. The courage to climb where courage alone could not survive. And that too was a kind of honor earned not in turning duels, but in the quiet, freezing struggle to breathe, where war had moved beyond the reach of human lungs. Snow came to Kyushu like a whisper, not the crushing northern blizzard of Hokkaido, but a quiet, persistent veil that softened roofs and muted sound. Yet nothing could mute the distant throb of engines overhead. In farm villages, children learned a new winter game, looking upward and counting silver specks and chalk-white trails, then guessing where the bombs would fall. At Itazuke, ground crews shoveled snow from runway edges, breath steaming, fingers numb inside stiff gloves patched with tape. Every morning began with the same ritual: warm engines, test oxygen, check ammunition feeds that froze like arteries in winter blood. The engineers cursed metal fatigue, cold cracked hoses, and supercharger gears that howled like tortured wolves when pushed too high. The enemy? He did not struggle so. Above, the B-29s flew insulated in heated cabins, oxygen steady, engines, breathing thin air as if it were sea-level breeze. Pilots sipped hot coffee from thermos flasks. Their gloved hands rested lightly on controls while turrets hummed smoothly, tracking threats that seldom arrived close enough to fire. The war had reached a state the samurai poets would never have imagined. Duels measured not blade against blade, but altitude against aspiration, engineering against exhaustion. January 12th. 08:12 hours. Siren. Multiple enemy aircraft, Angels 3-1. Course Tegu to Fukuoka. Tojos lined the taxiway, noses steaming, tailplanes dusted white. Raidens crouched under camouflage netting like predatory birds, waiting for a dawn that never favored them. Engines roared, exhaust flame pale in the morning cold. Takeoff roll shook frost from wing edges. Lift, retract, climb, always that slow ache upward, needles trembling, lungs tightening, every foot bought with heat and fury. At 25,000 feet, breath already came reluctant, like sucking air through cloth. At 27,000, masks began to crackle with ice at valve edges. A pilot tapped his regulator with knuckles stiff as bamboo stakes. At 28,000, a young flight leader whispered, half to himself, half to the gods of air, "Higher, higher, give us wings of steel." His Tojo shuddered, tail buffeting. Carburetor temperature dipped toward freezing. Still they climbed. Still they believed duty required them to touch the unreachable. Through frost-flecked canopies, the bombers appeared again. Silver giants sliding along contrail rails, serene, indifferent. Their turret guns glinted, optics and steel eyes searching. But few fighters reached firing range, and fewer still closed within meaning. A J-2M Raiden pilot made one desperate approach, dove from above to build speed, pulled into a zoom climb that strained canvas and steel, fired a 2-second burst. His tracers passed meters below a Superfortress belly. The gunner did not return fire. Perhaps he never even saw the attacker. The Japanese pilot leveled, breath shaking, eyes watering not from emotion but lack of oxygen. His engine spat a cough, demanded throttle he could not give without risking stall. He descended alone, weapon unfired again. Back at base, ground crews counted ammunition belts untouched. Mechanics lifted cowling plates and asked quietly, "How many rounds?" None expended. None fired? The pilot shook his head slowly, ashamed though he had done all physics allowed. I never reached them. His crew did not criticize. They bowed slightly, respectful, as if honoring someone returning from pilgrimage that granted no miracle. One whispered, "Even eagles tire chasing the sun." Briefing rooms grew colder, tea kettles steaming on iron stoves, officers in flight jackets thumbing thin manuals, charts unfurled, new tactics discussed, dive from above, zoom attack, improved oxygen discipline, fuel conservation. But the most sobering slide was mechanical. Engine power available above 8,000 meters, insufficient for interception except by dive advantage. Translated into the language of warriors, it meant, courage is not enough. A young pilot, barely 19, clenched his fist against this truth. What if we climb earlier, or loiter higher? The instructor, voice soft as falling snow, answered, "You cannot loiter where you cannot live." Silence filled the room. No one argued. Farm wives paused, beating laundry against rocks to watch raids pass overhead untouched. Children pointed sticks skyward like rifles, imagining they too could climb to the contrails. One boy asked his father, "Why don't our planes rise to chase them?" The father, once a soldier before age and exhaustion broke him, replied not with anger but with a sigh, "Because the sky has rules, and our machines obey them." In February, formations thickened. Contrails multiplied until the sky looked cross-hatched by chalk. Some runs brought incendiaries, others reconnaissance cameras, still others psychological weight heavier than bombs. The pilots of Japan no longer measured success by kills, there were none. They measured it by altitude touched, oxygen endured, the closeness of proximity to giants they could not bring down. In mess halls lit by weak bulbs, rice and barley steaming, pilots ate silently. No toasts, no bravado. One lieutenant said quietly, "We chase a castle in the sky." Another replied, "No, an empire of engines." And a third, rubbing frostbite from pale fingertips, whispered with steel under the words, "But we chase anyway." For even in futility, their discipline did not break. Honor endured where odds had collapsed. They rose each mission with the same ritual gravity, climbing into a sky that denied them, refusing surrender not because they believed in victory, but because duty does not ask if success is possible. It only asks to rise. Even when rising leads nowhere but thin air, frozen lungs, and the humbling sight of silver wings forever just out of range. They flew, knowing they could not strike, and still they flew. To fight a war one cannot touch is to learn the meaning of resolve. Spring did not come gently. It came sharply, like a blade drawn through winter fog. The plum blossoms opened pale and trembling across temple courtyards, but even the flowers seemed to strain upward as if listening for engines. By March, the contrails had become roads in the heavens. Children no longer pointed at them, they accepted them like weather. Women hanging seaweed on bamboo poles to dry hardly looked up when the silver shapes crossed. They knew the bombs were not for Kyushu that morning yet. At Itazuke and Ashiya, the atmosphere inside the ready rooms had thickened into something unnamed. Not despair, not resignation, not exactly. A more bitter alloy, a realization that war had changed shape into something their hands could not grasp, and still they flew. Enemy approaching, angels 3-2, 32,000 feet, no longer astonishing, now routine. Routine and impossible. A siren wailed across the field. Boots struck tarmac. The wind carried the stink of cold oil and stale rice. Mechanics ran with fuel hoses over shoulders, shouting hoarsely through scarves. Engines spun, radials roared, propeller arcs flickered in morning haze. Take-off, climb. The ritual had become muscle memory, like a prayer repeated not in hope of miracle, but because not saying it would be shame in the eyes of one's ancestors. At 20,000 feet, chatter dwindled to clipped breaths. At 25,000, sweat froze inside flight gloves. At 27,000, men stopped thinking of victory. They thought only of surviving the climb. By 29,000, awareness narrowed to needle tremble, the hiss of oxygen, and the cold bite of steel, biting into ribs beneath harness straps. Their hands trembled not from fear, but from starvation of oxygen and heat. Above them, the B-29s came like a city in the sky, each giant bomber shining like hammered silver, guns still, engines steady, cabin windows warm with sunlight, a palace in the stratosphere. A Ki-44 edged its way upward, like a swimmer reaching toward the surface from too deep. The pilot inhaled shallow, fog freezing around mask edges. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing. He was too far. Always too far. His guns pointed into a sky that never answered. He had climbed not to fight, but to witness power. Ground controllers logged the impossible with clinical handwriting. Interception attempt unsuccessful, insufficient climb. Enemy unengaged. Recommend higher blower gearing, improved oxygen, national prayer. The words drew quiet laughter around the plotting board, bitter, restrained, respectful toward futility. An older staff officer said softly, "Prayer is not a flight instrument." A younger one replied, "But even the Americans used prayer, only theirs burned in cylinders instead of incense." On the docks of Kokura, coal-stained laborers paused to watch the formations pass, unchallenged. One fisherman wrung salt water from rope and muttered, "These ones do not come to fight. They come to decide." His daughter, barely 6, traced contrails in the sky with a reed and asked, "Father, who writes in the air?" He answered, "Men with factories instead of swords." Pilots returned with lips blue, skin pale, eyes sunken not from fear, but from the altitude's slow theft of warmth and breath. Tea kettles steamed, gloves dried by charcoal stoves. Someone dropped a flight mask on the tatami floor. It struck with the dull thud of equipment that had failed its owner. The squadron leader unrolled a chart pinned with new American bombing routes. He tapped a point near Fukuoka. "They climb higher each week." "A," pilot whispered, "higher than we can learn." Another murmured, "Then we innovate." The room exhaled half hope, half exhaustion. But innovation without fuel, without engines capable of breathing that high, without the factories to birth them, innovation was paper against steel, and yet no one spoke defeat. Every sortie ended with the same ritual. Pilots bowed toward the rising sun, mechanics bowed back, silence lingered, heavy as frost. Eventually, someone would say the line that had become unofficial doctrine, "Tomorrow we climb again." It was not bravado, it was oath. Discipline born from centuries of warriors who understood death but had never imagined irrelevance. In April, a Shinto priest visited the airfield, offering purification prayers. He sprinkled salt along the runway, chanted beneath the windsock. Pilots bowed deeply, respectful. Afterward, one asked, "Will the gods make our engines stronger?" The priest's reply was gentle, almost sorrowful. "Even the gods breathe only air." And the pilots, tired, frost-burned, hearts cracked but not broken, nodded, understanding. Bombs fell on Yawata steelworks again. Black smoke folded upward like ink poured into water. Anti-aircraft guns barked, civilians covered ears. The fighters? They returned empty-armed, no rounds fired, no victories claimed. Only frost on goggles, coughs in lungs, and exhaustion that felt older than the pilots themselves. A mechanic bowed to one returning Raiden and said quietly, "You returned, that is victory." The pilot bowed deeper in reply, not triumph, not satisfaction, only honor. Yes, their guns were silent, but silence was not surrender. They had climbed to where they could not fight, and yet climbed again the next day. That was their war. Not in the kill, but in the refusal to stop rising. In old times, a samurai drew steel and met his foe eye to eye. Now, warriors raised wings instead of blades, knowing the enemy lived in a world their lungs and engines could barely endure. Still, they climbed. Still, they bowed. Still, they strapped in before dawn. Because honor does not ask whether victory is possible, only whether one rises to meet the sky. By May, Kyushu's hills glowed green again, tea shoots bright under morning dew, rice paddies mirroring the sky like liquid glass. Yet the season's softness could not conceal the destruction gathering overhead. Every dawn now belonged to engines, and every night carried the faint, metallic smell of distant cities burning. Rumor moved as fast as contrails. The American bombers had come lower. Not the day-high, silver B-29s gliding like armadas in the heavens, but night waves, streams of black-bellied shapes dropping fire instead of steel. Where winter had been a war of oxygen and altitude, spring became a war of smoke and ember. The first ashfall reached Fukuoka's outskirts in late May. Housewives sweeping porches paused when black snow dusted their sleeves. Children caught flakes, thinking them petals until the bitter, burned smell told another story. They stared at the sky, not at a threat, but at a prophecy. Japan's northern skies had once gleamed with the romance of aerial duels. Now they glowed not with tracer or searchlight, but with the slow orange pulse of cities dying by degrees. At Itazuke, the siren tone changed, no longer the crisp warble for altitude threats. Now a deeper wail rolled across the field, warning of incendiaries, low-level intruders, radar shadows cutting through mountain passes. American bombers no longer stayed in the untouchable kingdom of 30,000 feet. They descended now, still high, still fast, but nearer, brazen, as if daring interception. Crews sprinted. Oxygen tanks clinked, men's boots splashed through puddles of rain and fuel. There was no longer time to wait for altitude. And something else crept into the air. Hope. Dangerous hope. June 3rd. 01:42 hours. Night. Ragged with mist. Radar voice crackling through static. Enemy inbound. Multiple contacts. Angels 1 to 5 to 2 to 0. Fukuoka direction. Incendiaries reported. The scramble sounded more like desperation than order. Raidens designed for fleet protection, reshaped by necessity for homeland defense, howled into humid sky. This time, the climb felt different. Air was thicker. Engines roared with something close to eagerness. Wings bit the air decisively, not clawing thin stratosphere, but cutting dense night currents with predatory weight. At 12,000 feet, the clouds opened like theatre curtains. And there they were less majestic now, more menacing. B-29s blackened with soot streaks under their bellies, bomb bay doors yawning wide like jaws of iron lanterns. Below them, Fukuoka flickered rows of warehouses kindling, oil storage tanks blooming red like opened wounds. Tracer fire stitched darkness, searchlights swept like swords, and a Raiden pilot, Lieutenant Yamada Kaoru, saw what his comrades had long prayed to see, a target within reach. He dove. Gravity blessed him. Air thick as soup gave lift where thin sky once stole it. His guns roared 2 bursts, then a third. Orange blossoms of tracer streaked into darkness and struck aluminum skin. A flash, a wing dipped, a bomber lurched. Not destroyed, not yet, but touched. Touched. For the first time in months, Japanese gunners cheered in the control shack. Mechanics clapped gloved hands together like monks striking prayer blocks. Someone shouted, "We reached them!" as if the sky itself had been conquered. It lasted seconds. The bomber recovered, stabilizing like a wounded titan choosing to endure. But the message mattered more than the outcome. A Raiden had fired. A superfortress had flinched. Yet victory was not measured in bullet strikes that night. It was measured in heat rising from the city. The incendiaries fell like blossoms of death. Wind carried flame from house to house, across tile roofs and down narrow streets where wells ran dry and buckets passed between trembling hands. Pilots climbing back into clouds saw not their homeland but a lantern stretching horizon to horizon. A Ki-44 pilot whispered over radio, voice raw with smoke drawn through cockpit vents. "The earth burns like a forge." His wingman answered, "And we are blacksmiths with empty hammers." Planes landed in dawn's dim blue. Tires hissed on wet tarmac. Exhaust trails clung to ground like ghosts too tired to rise. No kill claims filed. No bombers downed. But fuel burned, rounds fired, lungs scorched and pride, for a moment, rekindled. In the debriefing hut, a sergeant poured barley tea with hands still shaking from adrenaline. "We reached them," he murmured again, as if afraid the truth would dissolve in daylight. His squadron leader corrected him gently. "We touched them. Reaching comes next." But his eyes betrayed the truth. Touching was miracle. Enough. By June, the pilots understood the shift. The enemy had traded altitude for volume, precision for devastation. They did not descend because they needed to. They descended because they could. An old major traced a finger across the map, pointing to Osaka, Kobe, Tokyo, Yokohama, all cities that had become scar tissue across the nation. He spoke not as officer, but as father and son of Japan. They no longer challenge our strength. They challenge our endurance. A younger pilot replied, teeth clenched, "Then we endure." There was no argument. There was only resolve. Men walked from briefings past smouldering hillsides, eyes stinging not solely from smoke. They had tasted combat again, tasted pursuit not of altitude dreams, but of real targets, real threat, real pain. And that, strangely, gave strength. Not victory strength. They wiped ash from canopies. They oiled machine guns that had spoken again after months of silence. They stood beside runways and watched, columns of smoke rise like wounded prayers into a sky that no longer felt so distant. For the enemy had come down from Olympus. And in the fires of cities, in the cough of engines, in the taste of ash on tongue, the defenders of Kyushu felt something they had forgotten. Fight, with teeth, with frost-bitten fingers, with engines that bled oil like lifeblood. Fight because the sky no longer forbade them entry. Tomorrow they would climb again. Tomorrow they would face fire again. Tomorrow they might die. But tomorrow, too, they might reach. And that possibility burned brighter than any city below. Summer returned to Kyushu in a breath of heat, so heavy it hung like wet cloth across shoulders. Cicadas screamed in the trees, drunk with humidity and sun, their voices rising like restless spirits. Heat shimmered off runway stones, and fuel drums sweated like living beasts under canvas covers. And overhead, the war deepened from strategy to siege. The Americans did not merely attack the cities now. They tested resolve. They sought to break not the body, but the breath, the hope, the belief that sky and soil still belonged to Japan. The B-29s still came, but now their shadows carried guardians. Long-legged shapes, sleek, with shark noses and silver wings, moved above and around them like hunting falcons. The rumor whispered at first in ready rooms now arrived as iron fact. The Mustang had crossed the ocean, P-51s. Airfields at Iwo Jima, built on blood and volcanic dust, now sent escorts to cradle the bombers all the way home. The defenders of Kyushu lifted binoculars skyward and saw them slender, pale shapes dancing lightly where Japanese fighters climbed like beasts dragging chains. One pilot spat into dust at the sight. So now we fight two enemies, the unreachable and the untouchable. His comrade answered, not in bitterness, but in weary admiration. We have always fought mountains. Now the mountains have guardians. By midsummer, aviation fuel arrived in trickles, not barrels. Mechanics siphoned from grounded trainers, from reserve drums, from trucks that would never drive again. They thinned fuel with alcohol and prayer. Pilots knew their missions by heart. Climb until lungs cry. Turn until vision graze. Return with tanks as dry as rice fields in famine. Each sortie became a gamble, not, will I shoot one down, but will I return at all? So engines were warmed, like old samurai unsheathing blades, with ritual, reverence, and the knowledge that misuse meant instant death. July 26th. 0900 hours. Heat already shimmered across hangars like rising ghosts. Radar voice crackled. Raid detected Angels 2 to 5. Escort present, many fighters. No panic now. Panic wastes oxygen. Panic wastes discipline. The scramble was practiced, quiet, resolute. A Ki-84 Hayate wheeled down the runway like a proud stallion. A Raiden followed, exhaust biting at the earth. A Tojo dragged its protest into the air, engine coughing like an old soldier clearing his throat for one more battle speech. They climbed, and this time, something new happened. At 15,000 feet, the threat came downward, not upward. Silver fangs, P-51s dropping from the sun like hawks stooping on cranes. Tracer lines stitched the sky. A Ki-44 exploded in orange petals. Another fell away, trailing fuel like falling silk ribbon. No chance to reach the bombers. The fight came early, too early. Captain Nakamura, veteran of New Guinea skies, rolled his Raiden hard right and down, searching Earth for sanctuary that did not exist. A Mustang slid behind him, lazy, patient, pilot confident in speed and altitude like a swordsman with reach advantage. Nakamura breathed once, steady, twice, shallow. Third breath he pulled. Engine roared. G-forces crushed ribs. Oxygen mask bit into cheek. He saw sun flash off the American canopy, and for a heartbeat, he was above again, predator, not prey. He squeezed the trigger. His guns spoke. A thin spark of hope lit the sky. And then, nothing. The Mustang rolled away untouched, climbing with effortless grace. His guns had fired, his aim true, the distance still too great. His Raiden quivered, engine temperature screaming, ammunition spent. He whispered to himself, "We fought, that is enough." He dove into cloud shadow, returning not triumphant, but unbroken. That same day, Kokura and Omuta burned beneath incendiaries. Black smoke boiled skyward, thick as grief. Steelworks glowed like molten dawn. Civilians fled through streets, carrying children and futons, faces streaked with ash and tears. In temples, priests beat drums, asking gods for wind or rain or miracle. The gods whispered nothing back. At airfields, men stared into the inferno and saw their own breath made visible in the heat. A mechanic whispered, "We keep engines breathing while the cities choke." A pilot replied, "We breathe because they burn. Not pride, duty, a terrible, raw duty." Night fell red that summer, horizon glowing like a furnace door. The cicadas fell silent. Smoke draped mountains like mourning veils. In mess huts, pilots sat in rows, hands wrapped around tea bowls, steam rising like fragile ghosts. Nobody spoke of victory, nobody spoke of surrender. They spoke only of tomorrow's climb. We go again. Yes. We go. Until when? Until the sky commands otherwise. By August, many knew the truth unspoken. Japan's air arm was bleeding out, one sortie at a time. No fuel, no altitude advantage, no time. And yet in notebooks, in marginalia of briefing maps, in frost-rimmed cockpits, one phrase appeared again and again: "We rise, even if we fall." Not because they believed in winning, but because they believed in showing up to fate with head unbowed. They did not defend cities alone, they defended identity, honor, the belief that breath, even ragged, was better spent in effort than in waiting for collapse. In that summer sky, where heat shimmered and steel screamed, they understood a final truth. Some battles are not lost in defeat. They are lost in refusing to fight. And so they fought not for victory, but for memory, duty, and the dignity of resistance in the face of inevitability. Dawn on Kyushu came grey and windless, a stillness so complete it pressed like cloth against the skin. No cicadas, no temple bells, no distant rumble of transport trucks or clatter of bicycle chains. Even the smell was different, less smoke, more dust and damp straw, as if the land itself held its breath. In ready huts across Itazuke and Ashiya, pilots stirred from thin sleep and listened. Listening itself had become ritual. Engine note, siren, distant thunder of B-29s. But this morning delivered nothing. No radar sirens, no scramble horns, only silence. Lieutenant Ishida slid open the hut's paper door. Cool air brushed his face, shock after months of furnace heat. He stepped outside and looked up. Not a contrail, not a spark of silver, he whispered, almost superstitious. Have they stopped coming? A sergeant shrugged, rubbing oil-stained hands on his uniform trousers. Even storms pause before the last blow. No one laughed. Men gathered near the operations shack like farmers waiting for weather. Mechanics leaned against fuel drums with crossed arms. Intelligence officers studied horizon lines as if the enemy might materialize from thin air. The stillness unnerved veterans more than raids. Raids at least followed logic. Silence felt like a verdict. At 0700 hours, the operations board remained blank. No sortie lines, no altitude assignments, no fuel allocations. Major Takagi entered. His uniform, once crisp, hung loose weight lost to stress and short rations. He set down his clipboard. "We fly no missions today," murmurs. A bitter half-laugh. Someone said, "Not enough fuel." Takagi shook his head. No orders, none at all. A bizarre thing in a military world, the absence of command. The room felt weightless, unmoored. "Stand by until further notice," he concluded, voice hollow. "Maintenance crews continue inspections. Pilots remain ready." Ready for what? In war, silence meant decisions made elsewhere, above them, beyond them. A Raiden pilot whispered to his bunkmate, "Perhaps the gods have grounded even the Americans," another replied, "or perhaps they prepare a blow that doesn't need wings." They didn't know it yet, but at that hour, far off across oceans, cables burned with messages that would change the world. By midday, whispers arrived, not official orders, not news bulletins, rumors floating like embers. Hiroshima. Something happened. A single bomb? Impossible. They say a city vanished. Laughter forced, disbelieving. Japan had seen B-29 firestorms erase districts, but a single bomb? No one believed it. Weapons required fleets, tons of incendiary gel, fuel in rivers of barrels. A mechanic scoffed. Americans love exaggeration. But then another rumor. Foreign radio says blinding light. And another. They speak of heat like the sun. Silence returned, heavier, frightened. Day faded to dusk without scramble call. Men tilted their heads to twilight sky out of habit. No engine growls, no contrails glowing pink in sunset. The heavens, once battlefield, lay undisturbed. Some felt relief, others felt dread. A sergeant lit a cigarette with hands that trembled. "I never thought I would fear quiet." To those who had battled altitude and oxygen starvation, fire and thunder, the absence of battle felt wrong. Their identity climbers of impossible sky, defenders of homeland suspended in air, August 9th. The second silence broke not with engine roar, but rumors scream renewed. Nagasaki, another. City, burning again. Not incendiaries, something else. Pilots sat on crude stools, maps before them, unused pencils resting like relics. Each rumor carved at certainty. Captain Nakamura asked quietly, "If the sky no longer decides battles, what are pilots for?" No answer came. Evening brought orders at last not to fly, but to wait. Wait and stand by. Japan still had fighters, still had men who would climb and die if told. But perhaps command understood. Wings could not fight suns falling from sky. Flights were grounded, fuel conserved. Airframes checked not for combat, but for symbolism proof Japan still could, should the order come. In barracks, men rolled up bedrolls, tightened boots, straightened uniforms. Habit sustained them where certainty failed. Then came the unheard of. A radio announcement. Formal, strange cadence. The Emperor's voice never before broadcast, soft, sorrowful, almost wind-like. Not one pilot fully understood the archaic phrasing, but meaning rose like dawn. The war was ending. Some stared blankly, some lowered heads. One man, fists clenched, whispered, "So we do not rise again." Not anger, loss. Identity unmoored. For months, the sky had been their judge and battlefield. Now it abandoned them, or they it. That evening, a mechanic quietly wiped down a Raiden's cowling, fingers lingering like farewell across metal skin. A pilot climbed into a cockpit not to launch, but to sit. He placed hand on throttle, on stick, on guns that would never fire again. A whispered prayer for those who climbed and did not return. He closed canopy, opened it again. The motion itself was ritual, sacred like bow before shrine. Night swallowed Kyushu. Cities glowed faintly on horizon, some burning, some dark from ruin. And above? Nothing. No distant drumming engines, no silver constellations of war machines. The sky, once predator, once shield, lay vast and empty. The war of altitude, of breath at edge of life, had ended not in thunder, but in suffocating quiet. One pilot wrote in diary that night, "We fought the wind until the wind vanished." When the sky returned to silence, we learned our struggle was not with enemy wings, but with history itself. And history has landed. Another scribbled only one line, "When heaven falls quiet, warriors must listen." And they did. In the darkness of late summer 1945, Kyushu slept without sirens. Above empty runways and grounded machines, stars shone indifferent, silent, eternal, untouched by the roar of engines or the cries of nations. The sky had gone silent, and the world beneath it had changed forever.